Hello, friends. Welcome in. Welcome to the show. So good to be with you. This is a very special live. I will be honest, we put this together pretty quick. I'm pretty impressed with the team, and I'm really excited for this one. We are responding to a podcast interview with Nancy Pearcey. We'll get into her in a few minutes here on the Alex Clark show, where she made the comment that women's suffrage, in her estimation, was a net loss, and also talked about how evangelical complementarian marriages tend to be better in every way than their counterparts. So we're going to get into all those claims and more. Few quick need-to-knows and announcements. If this is your first time watching, welcome. My name is Tim. I'm the creator of the New Evangelicals. The goal of this live is never to dehumanize our opponents or to treat them in bad faith. The goal is to respond to some of the claims and maybe offer a better way forward from what we're hearing. So this is not about trying to create clickbait or trying to say, look how foolish these people are. The goal is to hear the claims and then say, well, is that the way it is? And so on this episode of A Scholar Reacts, I brought on not one, but two amazing guests. I'm going to bring them in right now. Boom. Hi, friends. How are you?
Good.
I'm good.
Good. Let's have you both introduce yourselves. Sheila, let's start with you.
Okay, so I'm Sheila Gregoire, and we're doing academic introductions too for the purpose of this, I believe. So I have two master's degrees, one in research in sociology and one in public administration. And together with my team at Bare Marriage, we have conducted the largest studies of evangelical women's marital and sexual satisfaction done to date.
Great to have you. Thank you for making time. I mean, Sheila, you and I have had now a few different podcast conversations, so it's great to have you back on for a live YouTube. It's awesome.
Yeah.
And I'm Beth Allison Barr. I'm a professor of history at Baylor University. I'm the James Vardaman Endowed Professor of History here. I have my PhD now actually for 20 years from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill with specialization in medieval history, women's history, and religious history. So thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Now, both of you have written some amazing books.
Here's
I have it right here. I got you right here.
Thanks,
all right. So we have Beth Allison Barr's book here, The Making of Biblical Womanhood. I've read this book. It is amazing. I recommend it to everyone. It's available on audio. It's available wherever books are sold. And also, Sheila, I have your book right here as well. The Great Sex Rescue, The Lies You've Been Taught and How to Recover What God Intended. Another great book that has made quite the splash, no pun intended, in so many ways. So it's great to have you on. Now, we are responding to a podcast interview with Nancy Pearcey on the Alex Clark show. For those of you who don't know, Alex Clark is a podcast host. It's a podcast that's sponsored by Turning Point USA. If you watch any of our content, you know Turning Point and you know how I feel about Turning Point. We'll get into some of that as we kind of get along, but it's important to note that. Now, Nancy is a very interesting person because she is someone who really I would argue maybe the evangelical sense is really, she's on that circuit of like the apologetics space. She wrote, her most recent book is this one right here. It's called, there we go, The Toxic War on Masculinity. So she's actually been on quite a plethora of different shows. She's been on, I think I have a screenshot here. Let's see. There we go. Oh, that's not it. There we go. She's been on things like Ali Sucky's podcast, Relatable. She's been on John Mark Comer's podcast, on Elisa Childers' podcast. So she's been around, and her background, here's how she describes herself on her website. Nancy Pearcey is a best-selling author and speaker, a former agnostic. She was hailed in the economist. I can't pronounce that. Anyway,
Economist.
Thank you. I'm like having a brain fart today. The Economist, as America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectual. Her work has appeared in the Washington Post, the Washington Times, First Things, Human Events, American Thinker, Daily Caller, The Federalist, CNS News, and Fox News. She has appeared on NPR, C-SPAN, and Fox and Friends. She is currently a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. Pearcey's books have been translated into 19 languages and include Total Truth, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, Love Thy Body, and The Toxic War on Masculinity. So she has been around, and that's important for us to recognize. So there's kind of two parts to this response. The first part is her take on women's suffrage and then getting my co-hosts here and their feedback. And then the other side is her claims about marriage, complementarian marriages, in particular, the war on men, etc. So I think what we're going to start is we're going to pull the clips up with Nancy talking to the podcast host about women's suffrage. And Beth, that's really, I know, your expertise here. So the goal is we'll kind of go through the clip, and as you find things, we'll stop the video and we'll have kind of your response. Does that work for everyone?
Yes, and just for everyone watching, just in case you don't know, women's suffrage is women's right to vote. Sometimes people don't know what that means. So
I love that. I'm happy that you beat me too, because one of my questions was going to be, let's just start real basic. How do we think about the term women's suffrage and what does it mean? So women's right to vote. Okay, cool. Well, here we go, friends. Without further ado, I see you all in the comments, by the way. Yes, I know, right here. These people are legendary. Absolutely. They really are. It's amazing. I'm kind of honored. I'm kind of fanboying myself. So it's great. Let's start and have you guys respond. Here we go.
Christian men. I don't think I had ever known this before reading your book. You write that there were actually a lot of women who were against women's suffrage at first.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you read even the feminists at the time, I have the quotes, I have the receipts. I have the quotes from the leading feminists at the time saying, the biggest barrier is that women.
Can we stop here?
In favor of the vote.
We absolutely can. We're 30 seconds in. I'm happy to pump the brakes. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So I will tell you that I've been teaching actually 4 back-to-back semesters of a class, basic history class at Baylor called Votes for Women. And I've taught it in England. I've taught it in London. And then I taught it twice last semester. And let me just clarify that there is no surprise among scholars that women oppose the vote. It took more than 75 years in the US for the 19th Amendment, which, by the way, does not give women the right to vote. It keeps states from using sex to disqualify women from voting. That's actually what the 19th Amendment does. It keeps, just like the 15th Amendment made it where you couldn't use race to disqualify former slaves from voting. That's what the 19th Amendment does. And there is no surprise among scholars. We know that women opposed the vote. We know that men obviously opposed the vote. There are lots of reasons for this, but I think it's important to note that there are some consistencies among the women that were most vocal in what we call the antis, and they were women of a particular race and class who were more privileged in society, who worked to protect that privilege. So let me just throw that out there. As I said, for people who didn't realize that there were people who opposed the vote. I mean, that's why it was a fight for suffrage, because it took 75 years, this fight. But let me also say that from the very beginning, when the Constitution of the U.S. was first written, women already were speaking up and saying, you need to specifically include us in this for citizenship. And Abigail Adams actually wrote that to her husband, John Adams, saying, don't, remember the ladies, is what she said. She said, because we know men are tyrants. So remember the ladies. And so this is, yes, there were women who opposed the vote, but from the very beginning, women also realized the cost of being excluded from the Constitution as citizens with full equal rights as men. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, I just want to add, I think this is a very strange argument because every social change has the majority of people disagreeing with it at the beginning. If people hadn't disagreed with it, we wouldn't need to change anything. So it's just a strange argument.
Can I ask one follow-up question, Beth, if you don't mind?
Sure.
What was some of the reasoning behind women not wanting the right to vote? Because I just think it's so counterintuitive. What am I missing here?
Well, I mean, think about it. I think one of the most recent parallels is the Equal Rights Amendment, and which was failed because women fought against it. I mean, it's actually a really fascinating historically time to watch. And I find some of the videos with Phyllis Schlafly and her conversations with the women, I mean, they're just so fascinating. But nonetheless, but a lot of the reasons that women spoke against the vote were reasons that women spoke against the ERA. Some of them argued that women will lose privilege. I mean, that's one of the arguments, that women will lose privilege. Women will have to serve on juries. Women will have to serve in the military. Women will have to have the full responsibilities of being a citizen if women are given the full responsibilities of being a citizen. And so this is one of it, is that women are like, hey, we're good. We don't have to do these things. Why should we be made to do them? So and if you watch, was a big part of Phyllis Schlafly's argument against the ERA. And it's what we see come up with these women in the late 19th and early 20th century. Some of it too, we have to know that a lot of the antis, although they are spread throughout the US, there are a lot of arguments coming from the South. And with the South, those arguments are tied to racism. It's a lot easier to keep, if you let everybody vote, then everybody gets to vote. But if you keep vote reserved to only a particular group in society, which is white men, then that means that white women can influence those white men, but people of color don't have the right to vote. And so, I mean, that there is some racism. Now, there's also racism. There were a lot of racist women in the suffrage movement itself who are fighting for the vote. That's actually it's on both sides. Racism is deep on both sides here. But some women argued that women didn't have the education to vote, which for many of them was probably true. And they were worried about working class women. They were saying like, hey, we're educated, we can do it. But these working class women, I mean, if all women get the right to vote, that means all women get the right to vote. And there's going to be the type of people we don't want voting. The ones who don't have the intellectual or the mental capacity to be able to vote. Some women just said, we don't really need the vote. They were like, all this is going to do is double the amount of the electorate. And so how is that really going to change anything? I mean, this is kind of a strange argument too. But it's like, how is this going to change anything? And then also a lot of the antis, they were like, hey, women aren't going to vote as a block. So it's stupid to talk about the women's vote. They were right on this. Women don't vote as a block. Men don't vote as a block. We vote as individuals. And so they were correct about that. But some of them argued, they were like, look, you're saying that if women get the right to vote, it's going to fix all social ills. And they were like, that's not true because women don't vote as a block. They're actually right about that. I think I'll tell you one more. One of the most fascinating reasons that women didn't want the right to vote is because they argued that the vote had corrupted men. Being in politics made men corrupt. And so if women got in politics, they would become corrupt too. So,
and doesn't that kind of go along with the angel of the house ideal in the Victorian era, where women were these domestic goddesses and they were kind of protected from the outside world so that they could keep the home into this beautiful place of refuge for the men, and that this whole domestic goddess sort of ideal was born in the Victorian era. And so if women vote, then suddenly the home is no longer this place of refuge because now she has been corrupted by politics too. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, and there was the argument that women could influence the men to vote correctly because that works really well.
Well, that's really informative. Thank you for sharing that. All right, let's keep moving on then. We're 30 seconds in. Here we go.
And so that's very puzzling. So I looked at the what was going on at the time, and the debate. You see, the vote meant something very different. My female students are like, well, if I didn't have the vote, I would feel like I wasn't a full citizen. But that's not what it meant back then. Back then, only landowners had the vote. That meant, remember, since we had home industries, family industries, if you were a homeowner, you also were a business owner.
Right.
And so it was assumed that if you were a landowner, you had experience running a business. And so you weren't just, an average person on the street. You were someone who had run a business and had a lot of responsibility. And
I want to jump in.
Done. Go ahead.
This is really hard. So I understand where perhaps this is coming from for her. In the US, when the Constitution was written, the people who had the right to vote were freeholders. And they were men of a particular age, of a particular faith. Catholics mostly couldn't vote. Jewish people couldn't vote. People of color obviously couldn't vote. All of these restrictions. And then they also were freeholders, which they did argue that people who owned property had more of a stake in the social order, so to speak. But at the same time, people saw this as problematic from the very beginning. And shortly after shortly after the Declaration of Independence, Constitution, everything, states tried to rewrite this and make it not just freeholders, but just simply people who had a certain level of income, property ownership. And then also at the same time, women actually were voting from the very early times in the US, because a lot of it was about states' rights. And so, like, for example, there's actually a funny clause in New Jersey, right, in the late 18th century, where they extended the vote to all inhabitants and women got to vote. And women did vote.
That's my state. All right.
Yeah,
Go
yeah.
New Jersey.
Oh, there you are. Yeah. They later changed it, but I mean, it's interesting. Wyoming gave women the right to vote very early on. Utah gave women the right to vote early on. Colorado gave women the right to vote. I mean, actually, by the time we get to the early 20th century, there are already states that have given women the right to vote, at least in some capacity. And so it's not like we went from one system to another system. That's not an accurate assessment of what's going on, because there were individuals who were already voting, and that the property were the standards for who could vote based upon property were already shifting. There was seen that there were problems with this. Also, there were women who were heads of household. This is something, and so, this is not a monolithic, like a shift from one philosophical ideology to another philosophical ideology. It's much more complex than that. And the reality is that women were voting already during this whole time period. So.
Okay, that's really helpful to know. Whenever I have historians, of your caliber on, it's always such a reminder that these things are so much more complicated than it was this way, and then like a light switch, all of a sudden we have this new thing. It's just way more gray, it seems like, so often.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, and as I said, I think we should note that one of the reasons this even becomes an issue is because in the 18th century, with the rise of democracy in the US and with France, think about this is also going on in France, we have constitutions being written that are defining citizenship. And this is actually a new thing in history, this defining. And so then it becomes who gets to be a citizen. And women are weighing in this conversation from the very beginning. And so when Nancy Pearcey says this isn't about citizenship, that's actually not true. Women from the very beginning knew it was about citizenship. And that's what their argument was, is that we should be fully citizens alongside men. So
yeah, it's interesting how historically it was often the areas of the world where you were forging new lands kind of thing. So you had the West, you said that, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, women were voting already. And
yes, yeah.
The women in the British Empire who had the vote first were New Zealand, which in really early, like 1893 or something like that.
Yeah.
But they were, and because this was like a new land, obviously there's indigenous issues, and I don't mean to hurt those,
right.
But
they didn't get the right to vote. Yeah.
Right. And then in Canada we had Manitoba. And so in places where women were totally involved in building homes and in the prairies and in land that hadn't been occupied except by indigenous people. And obviously we took over those lands, but that's where you got the vote. It wasn't necessarily in the big cities.
Yeah. And I'll throw out two things there with that. First of all, with Wyoming, that's actually one of the ways that they recruited people to come, is they were like, hey, women, you not only can homesteader, you can come out here and own property, but vote. The other thing is in England, actually, women did have the right to vote in England until the 1832 Reform Bill. And so that it went backwards. And so, I mean, this is kind of, I mean, it's because in England there was no consistency, but it wasn't written in that sex was a disqualifier from voting until 1832. So again, as I said, these are conscious decisions being made to write women out, and with women not being completely written out, and with women always in that argument, saying why they should have the right to vote, as well as people of color also making those arguments. So anyway.
Love that. Thank you. That's really helpful. Zach Lambert's here. He says, hey, Beth, Sheila,
hey,
and Tim.
Zach.
Thank you for doing this. Grateful for all three of y'all and your courage, wisdom, expertise. Zach, great to have you. Thanks for watching. All right, friends, let's keep going.
And who didn't have the vote? A lot of people didn't have the vote. So women didn't feel, set out. They didn't feel like, oh, I'm especially unprivileged because I don't have the vote. Nobody had the vote except the landowner. If you were not, if you were a servant, if you were a hired hand, if you were a working class person, if you were the extended family, if you were not responsible for the home, the household, it was called the household back then. You didn't expect.
I have to jump in again. I'm so sorry.
Please don't apologize. This is why we do this. Please go for it.
This is really hard. So I want to say again, make that emphasis that it was freeholders who could vote. The household status for voting in the U.S. is 1951, the head of household. That's where we actually get that phrase. Now, I could go back to the medieval and I could talk about that we did have household, but that it's a different, anyway. So I'm just going to keep it to right here with the U.S. I think it's important to note that the head of household was put in there for single people with dependents so that they could claim those tax, they could get the tax write-offs. And so so I think we need to clarify what head of household in the U.S. actually was introduced into the tax law for. So anyway, there you are. Just going to throw that out there.
That's very helpful to know because I honestly, this is clearly not my expertise and I wouldn't even think about that. I didn't realize that even this terminology is somewhat more recent, historically speaking.
Well,
so.
It's, I don't want to say, household isn't more recent, but it's, again, I think there is an impression that's given with Pearcey here and with her audience that there was like a nuclear household, Little House on the Prairie ideal in the 19th century, and that we moved from that household vote to whatever we have today, where everybody's all about individualism. And that is simply not true. That is not historically accurate at all. So
that is so helpful for me because you're right. That's how I kind of perceive this kind of world and what they're advocating for is like,
right.
Well, back then we had this nuclear family unit that was like this thing. And then, the liberation of whatever happened, feminism, whatever. And then the whole thing got destroyed.
Right.
And, Western civilization is falling. That's kind of how they
all fallen. That's right. Yeah.
Right. So it's helpful to have you be like, well, again, like there's parts that maybe could be true in the language, but it didn't mean what we think it's how they're maybe representing it now, for example. So that's great. All right, let's keep going.
And by the way, it's interesting. Even the word family was usually used for the household. They used the word family for anyone that you were responsible for, even if you were not biologically related.
Why would it be important in a book about toxic masculinity and the misconceptions surrounding that term to include a section about women's suffrage?
Yeah. So when the women's vote came up, the debate was not over men's vote versus women's vote. It was household vote versus individual vote. And if you read the anti-suffragists back then, many of them said explicitly, we want household suffrage because otherwise there's just the individual in the state. We don't want that kind of individualism. We want the basic unit of society to remain the household. We don't want the basic unit of society to be the individual.
Wow.
So that was their argument. It was a political philosophy.
I see a hand raised.
What is the basic unit of society?
It's so fun watching Beth's expressions.
I'm
I
trying,
feel like I should be the
y'all.
one raising my hand. You're the professor.
I don't have a poker face. I'm so sorry. So let me just say that she is correct about the anti-literature. In fact, one of the links that I gave you, Tim, for this goes to it has a lot of primary sources of this anti-suffrage literature. And one of the arguments that they did make was that that the vote, that they wanted the vote to be representative, again, of the household. Their husbands spoke for the household. Why do they need the right to vote? This is going to take women out into the public sphere. They also have a whole lot of things, like some of the images show men like doing dishes and holding the baby and saying, my wife votes, and now, I'm stuck with all of this. I mean, you thought we invented that stuff in the 70s and the 80s, that type of, but anti-feminist thing, but no, that's going on from the very beginning. So it is true that they did make that argument. But again, when I said, you have to think about who's making that argument. And these are women who come from more privileged households, who have the privilege of not having to work. Many of them have had the privilege of actually getting to go to college and are educated. They get to do a lot of stuff outside the household because it is of their class. They have this privilege. And so they're like, we get to do all of this when we don't have the responsibilities. Why do we want to shift this dynamic? But the problem is, and this is one of the things that women who, especially women of color, I mean, I strongly encourage you to go read Mary Church Terrell. But, argue, they were like, not everybody is from that place of privilege. Mm-hmm. And that those women have no say over what happens to them. They don't get to stay. They're already out in the world. I mean, many of them, they don't have stable male figures. Some of them that do, they're all working. I mean, it's not representative of the working class lifestyle. And I think that, I put one of the suggestions I also gave you on that list I sent for this of resources is I sent the book, The Five, which my students love. I always teach it. It's about the women who were killed by Jack the Ripper. And so my students love it for that, but also because it shows the conditions that women lived under in the 19th century who had absolutely no legal protection. So
that is really helpful to make sense of things, because I've noticed that sometimes in these spaces you have this, what seems like a paradox of people maybe like Ali Stuckey or Candace Owens who are on a platform saying, good women are at home and like making babies, essentially. That's like the highest calling, but they have very lucrative careers making a lot of money and are probably in some cases even the breadwinner. And I'm like, I don't understand like how this works. So again, your explanation kind of helps to unpack some of that and how those things can live simultaneously.
Yeah, just go read The Five. If anybody wants to know what women's lives were like who were not in these privileged classes, just go read The Five. It's really good.
I'll make sure, folks, if you're listening either on the podcast later on or right now during the live, that we have those links in the show notes, both on YouTube and on podcast. All right, we'll keep moving.
Of society, is it a household, or is it the bare, isolated, disconnected individual?
And they are so right on with that prediction of what would happen.
Exactly. And of course, people say, well, why did the vote finally pass then? Well, it took a long time, almost a century. You know why women were finally won over? By the Temperance Movement. Frances Willard, who was the president of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, began to feel that women would have more power over against their drunken husbands if they had the vote. She argued that women had no recourse if their husbands were drinking away the family money and leaving the family destitute, if they were coming home drunk at night and beating their wife and kids.
So wait, Temperance Movement is what, like alcohol prohibition stuff?
Yeah, prohibition. In other words, you have to almost back up a little bit to understand even why that was such an issue. As men became more secular, sort of the traditional male vices became worse. In other words, in the 19th century, there was a huge increase in fighting, gambling.
Can I pause and add my own?
I was trying to hold it in.
I want to jump in on this one. Oh my gosh.
Can I just say one brief thing, and I'll let you guys have it. I'm going through Fever in the Heartland about the KKK in like that time. And like the stories of all of these white Protestant Christian men who were claiming and trying to fight against, alcohol and have prohibition, behind the scenes were all drinking. It was like a very open secret, that they all liked their liquor. So it's just interesting to hear even that side of things, how it's like, well, I'm not sure if it was about them becoming more secular necessarily. So anyway,
can I tell a really funny story?
Sure.
So the way we got the vote in the US, it all came down to Nashville. If you don't know anything about, it's a really dramatic story. My students love it. But the people, those for suffrage and those against suffrage, the antis, they all actually camped out at the same hotel, the Hermitage Hotel, which you can go to, go have tea. I went with my sister this past summer, and you can see the Capitol out right across from it. And the antis, those against suffrage, they actually booked out one of the one of the higher floors in the hotel, and it became the Jack Daniels suite. And so the way that they tried to get people to vote against the vote for women was by giving them free liquor. And so that's the antis. So, I mean, we've got to, and I also want to jump in about Willard too. It is true that the Christian Temperance Union played a significant role in the suffrage movement. It is true that Frances Willard argued that because women had no other recourse to protect themselves, they needed to get the right to vote. This is true. Women had no legal recourse to protect themselves. And she said it got even worse as alcohol became cheaper and more prevalent. I mean, not because it was cheaper. And so this working class. So those things are true. We do have, as with the market economy, with cheaper alcohol, we do have a lot of, bars opening up. No, male vice did not get worse. Male vice just became more public in these bars. And we also see that women who were empowered through education and also this belief that they had the right to influence and be involved in politics begin to speak out against this male vice. So the thing that empowers the temperance movement is essentially the suffrage movement. And so, I mean, it's not like all of a sudden women decided to vote for the vote so they could protect the home. That's a very simplistic understanding. I would point people towards Connie McConaughey's book came out. Corinne McConaughey. I knew I was saying the wrong thing. Corinne McConaughey, but she has a really fantastic book on a reappraisal of suffrage in the U.S. And she argues that it was actually a transformation of politics because the way women got the vote was through making coalitions. And so there is no one reason why women succeeded. There's no one reason why women succeeded. It was because they were really successful in making coalitions. And so I want to put that out there. That's a better way of looking at this.
Very helpful.
Yeah, and that was definitely true in New Zealand too. The New Zealand model was really interesting because they had with politics. But my great grandmother was one of the founding members of the WCTU in London, England. Because my great grandfather was total drunk, and he got over it later in his life. But the suffrage movement and the temperance movement, which it seemed like Alex Clark wasn't familiar with, which I find interesting. But it was so tied to women's dignity and women's worth because abuse was so rampant and incredible poverty was so rampant because the men were drinking away the paycheck. And then you combine this with Josephine Butler's work in London at the same time, trying to get some of the terrible prostitution laws off the books. And so she ended up working with the Temperance Union and with the suffragettes, and it was all a big coalition in London. But I don't understand why Nancy is even talking about this, because this disproves her point. And that's the bigger issue that I'm having, because she is admitting, and she goes on to admit further in this clip, how bad men were treating women, and that's why women needed the vote. And yet the reason that she ends up saying women shouldn't have gotten the vote is because we need to go back to a time when we have just men having the vote, because then they are going to think more about their families and they're going to be more altruistic. Well, guess what? They weren't. That's why women wanted the vote. I don't even get what she's saying here.
Yeah, no,
I'm your entire argument.
I agree in the sense, because the temperance movement, women had less access to property. They had less access to legal rights. Women had, they had less access. They had very few recourses. And there's a lot of problems with Frances Willard. There was some deep racism within her also. There's a very famous incident with her with Ida B. Wells, and where Ida B. Wells calls her out for it. And Frances Willard actually never apologizes really for it. So so there's a lot of problems also with the temperance movement, at least the key leaders, as with the suffrage movement. There are some very racist women, Alice Paul in there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, etc. But I think we have to realize we again have to place who is speaking, and the women who are speaking are from positions of power and privilege, and so the antis and a lot of their arguments for and against each other actually were excluding the voices of ordinary women and women of color. And so I think it's always important that we remember that the vote, even the discussions about the vote, excluded a lot of women who had no legal recourse to anything.
Beth, I really appreciate that you're willing to call balls and strikes as we kind of navigate for people like me, we're just so ignorant on, and I really appreciate that. I think it just demonstrates that you take this stuff really seriously, that you really want to know what's going on, and so I think it's really helpful. So thank you. All right, this is great. Let's keep going. Let's learning.
Try to
so
get
much.
Through it all.
We're gonna do it. We're gonna do it. This is how these lives always go. We have all the stuff planned, and the conversation takes on a really good life of its own, and that's what's happening here. Happy to have you guys on board.
Drinking, crime, prostitution, the number of brothels mushroomed. Sometimes the individual fact can help. So in 1830, Americans drank 3 times as much as they do today. So there's a reason there was a temperance movement. Alcoholism was public alcoholism was a problem the way, drug addicts are today. You walk down San Francisco or someplace.
Like the fentanyl crisis today was really like the alcohol crisis then.
Yeah, today you see people, drug addicts on the streets. Well, back then people were falling down drunk in the, in the alleys and so on.
That still happens pretty often.
The temperance movement was really about trying to protect women who had no legal recourse, against drunken husbands. And so that's how they finally won the vote.
This is undermining her argument, though. That's what I don't understand.
Sheila, are you saying essentially that what Nancy is advocating for is going back to a time when these things were a problem, and then the solution to that gives women the vote, but she wants that erased to go back to that time that caused the problem?
She's saying the reason that we need men to have the vote is because when men vote on behalf of the household, they are forced to take on the protector role, and they are forced to think of other people. And so this puts men into a category of being the protector for others. And now she's explaining the reason that women wanted the vote was because men weren't protecting them. So I just think this whole thing undermines her argument, but whatever.
That actually unlocks a connection for me. I think I'm understanding. I want to repeat it back to make sure I'm catching the logic here for the audience as well. So essentially, one of the maybe things underneath of this is that by giving other people, in this case women, the vote, it's taking away the responsibility that men have to protect their households and to be a good, upstanding, virtuous man. But we had an example of what that was like, and it didn't work out at all how she's talking about. So going back to that is only going to potentially exacerbate the problem and take away the rights of women who are not in privileged spaces, who need that voting power to be able to have a say in our democracy. Is that kind of the vibe? Am I threading that needle?
Yeah, I would call it the I'm going to take my ball and go home political philosophy, which is what sounds like she's arguing. So she's arguing that we want men, and that's what her whole book is about, how we want men to be virtuous. We want men to be protectors. We want men to look after people. But it's hard for men to do that in today's culture because we've become this individualized culture where we don't value men's protection the way that we used to when we had this family household vote. But essentially, what she's saying is men are only going to be protectors if they get to be in charge. And so if they don't get to be in charge, they're going to take their ball and go home. And so we need to put men back in these positions again. And I just think it's a very strange argument.
Okay, understand. That's very helpful. All right, we'll keep going then.
Frances Willard actually renamed the vote the Ballot for Home Protection.
That's true.
They didn't win it on feminist grounds. The feminists were arguing things like autonomy and individual rights. That didn't win over the women. The women were won over when it was labeled the Ballot of Home Protection.
I've never heard any of this
That's
in my
not
entire
true.
life.
Okay, it's not true. I'm
Well,
here for it. Go ahead.
again, I'm just saying that this is this idea that women were always fighting for the vote, fighting for citizenship. They recognized that from the very, very beginning. This is not like all of a sudden we have these, it's not like Frances Willard comes along and suddenly women are like, oh, because it's about the home, we're going to get involved now. That's some of the story, but that is not all of the story. And so I just think we got to be really careful with that. I do think, though, that what Frances Willard did is that she made, because she already had a base, she built her base in, hey, we've got to do something about protecting women who have no legal recourse. And then she used that, fighting against alcohol. And so she built this base fighting against alcohol. And then she said, hey, y'all, what would actually be really helpful is if we could actually vote against this, against alcohol, and women could be a part of making this change. And her base was like, yes. So, I think we have to understand what was going on here. It's not exactly the way that Nancy presents it, which makes it sound like that women decide to get involved because it's about defending the household. That's not exactly it.
That's very helpful.
Never heard any of this in my life.
So knowing this background does help us understand that there were huge mental shifts happening. So today, when we think, oh, well, if you don't have the vote, you're not you're not a full citizen. That's not the way it was thought of. In fact, there was another turning point that was very important: universal male suffrage. When you went from only the landowner, the head of the household, holding the vote, to universal male suffrage, that came first. Well, all of a sudden, you had men who were uneducated, drunk. Women are saying, "Wait a minute, these guys vote and I can't."
Right? Yeah, that would be frustrating.
People who had no civic spirit. And Christian, women who say, look,
okay, I promise I'm going to stop Tim and let you get through. I think it's really interesting how Nancy phrased that, because the way she phrased that is actually very similar to the very racist responses of like Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who actually was like, are you kidding me that you're giving Black men the right to vote over people like me? And so it's interesting that Nancy uses language very similar to that to say this is what made women frustrated. That is true. That racist element that said, hey, I can't believe you're giving these people the right to vote over me. And that actually did play out in some people's motivations. I also think at this point, I have it up here. I pulled it up here just a minute ago. Can I read Abigail Adams' short statement that she sent to her husband about? I think it's important because what Nancy Pearcey keeps saying here is that this isn't about citizenship. Yeah. It was always about citizenship. So, so Abigail Adams writes this to her husband on March 31st, 1776. John Adams is at the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. And as we know, he's later one of the early presidents of the U.S. And she says, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power in the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation, end quote.
Wow.
I think that pretty much shows that what Nancy Pearcey is saying is simply not true. Women knew what was at stake. And they understood that they were not being written in as full citizens. Go read Mary Wollstonecraft. Go read in England. Women are making parallel arguments when they are getting written out of the laws. This isn't. Women understood it was about citizenship, and they argued that they should have the same type of citizenship rights as men.
Powerful.
And that's what's so strange in her book too. Like, I know we're listening to this, what she said on this podcast, but in her book, when she talks about women's suffrage, she talks about it almost entirely from the anti-suffragette side. She doesn't give the reasons that people were really wanting the vote. It's very strange. It's very, very strange.
Yeah.
Before we move on, this is very important. Breaking news. Sheila, your hair looks absolutely fab today. Love the color and how it matches with Rebecca. Because I know before we started recording, you're like, this was a bad time to dye my hair with a streak of blue in it. But there you go. The audience loves it.
Here I am. I'm trying to be like respond to a conservative when I dyed my hair blue. But I have a grandbaby coming in the next few days, and I wanted the cool grandma shots. So
I love it. Mission accomplished. Okay, we're getting through it. This is so good. I love this video. This is awesome. The audience is loving it. We have 130 people watching live with us. It's great. Let's keep going.
And you're letting these secular guys who are alcoholics or, fighting, drinking, visiting prostitutes, and they have a right to vote, and I don't.
So we get women's suffrage. Now, looking forward all these years later, where we are now, do you believe that women's suffrage has been a net negative or a net positive for society?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's been a net negative to go from the household vote to the individual vote.
Let's just stop that. I think we almost need to replay that again, because this is the clip that Alex Clark used in this reel to highlight what it was going to be about. She put in the description, that women's suffrage was a net negative. Like, this is the money quote right here. Yep. That what she's arguing is that women's vote was a net negative to society.
And I think it should be important to highlight that she just did describe how part of the reason why that happened was for the temperance movement and alcohol and abusive husbands. So even with that in the back end, right? For her, she says that it's still a net negative. I'll play the clip again and then we can respond to it.
You have a right to vote and I don't.
So we get women's suffrage. Now, looking forward all these years later, where we are now, do you believe that women's suffrage has been a net negative or a net positive for society?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think it's been a net negative to go from the household vote to the individual vote. That shit.
Do you think that is, she seems to clarify like what she's talking about by going from household to the individual vote. I don't know if that's maybe, if Nancy is watching this, maybe she'd be like, well, that's what I meant by, it being a net negative, is that where we move from this familial family unit model to like the individual autonomy model, and that's what's given us all the problems. I don't know.
I've been arguing with her and her proxies on Twitter all weekend about this, but basically what she's saying is, I'm not philosophically against women voting. I'm just philosophically against the means by which women would vote. There is no difference. It's a distinction without a difference.
I don't think it matters, because I think what she's arguing here isn't a historical reality, the shift. It's not like we went fully from, I think this is a misunderstanding of household vote. It gives us this image of this idyllic nuclear family out on the prairie where everyone's concerned about each other. Clearly this is not what's going on in the 19th and the 20th century. One of the reasons why women are very much, if you listen to Abigail Adams, she said, remember, men are tyrants. Women need to have these legal protections. And this is clearly, I always start off my suffrage class with the first third of the class is on the conditions of women's lives. And that's what we do, is we talk about the conditions of women's lives and we intersect that with race. And so like Mary Church Terrell, this isn't an exact quote, but she says, white women need the vote, but Black women needed it even more because of the conditions of their lives. They needed to have that legal empowerment. And so I think what Nancy is, and if you think about, Black people, even if she's correct about this household vote unit thing, this excludes all Black people. It excludes Native American people. It excludes households that don't fit that type of single women were head of household at this time, did have their own. And so, it's just, I don't understand if she's arguing about the shift from household vote. Women were voting before this. So you can't, it just doesn't make sense in the model that she is talking about. It's not a historical reality. And it's also it seems to be rooted in not just patriarchy, but also in racism.
Yeah.
And I think that's so, thinking about as me as a privileged white woman, my life, I get to do things because of my privilege, and I need to recognize that. And that it's not all about me getting to keep what I have. It's also about how can I make sure that other people have similar opportunities. And so it's a very narrow perspective from which she is talking, and it frightens me that a lot of women think this is reasonable.
Yeah.
And again,
100%.
I think it's just really, really important to remember that when people make the argument that we need to go back to the household vote, they are saying we need to go back to a time when only rich white men voted.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
We simply can't let people get away with that, because that is what they are saying. And that's not okay. And again, the reason that she's saying this, it's part of a wider argument that she's making in her book, which is that we want to think of men as the protectors, as the ones in charge, as the ones who are leading women, but they're doing so benevolently. And it's a lot like, do you remember Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem in like the late 1890s, The White Man's Burden? It's a horrible poem. But it's how hard it is to be a white man and have to civilize the world because the world is so terrible. And so like, look at us, like how hard this is for us to go in and have to work. And that's very much the feel that you're getting is, we need to let men run things because this is so difficult for them. And we need to realize what a burden it is for them to have to think about everybody else. And we need to support them in that. And that's what she's trying to argue.
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what Christy said here, that Nancy's not alone, not a lone voice on this right now. There's a whole generation of young women looking to reverse the rights that we were granted. That's completely correct. I mean, the trad wife movement is growing, and honestly, this turning point space, it seems to be embracing this anti-suffrage perspective. I actually have a clip we'll share later of Jason Whitlock at America Fest saying the same thing in front of 10,000 people to a round of applause. And this also does seem to have overlap, whether it's intentional or not, with like almost like this, the soft, the like servant leadership model of the complementarian evangelical world, right? Like, well, men just need to sacrifice more and be a better leader. That will solve the problem. And I definitely hear some overlaps and some echoes of that kind of thought in what it really would become if people got their way, taking away the right of women to vote and to shape our country in favor of men.
It's mind-boggling to me when we hear people talk about the net gain or loss of women. I mean, first of all, this goes against the whole thing. Women don't vote as a block. Men don't vote as a block either. And we never have. And so, I mean, that is just mind-boggling to me. But I also think that people today don't realize how recently in the future that even though women got the right to vote in 1920, it's a hard fight for women of color to have equal access to the right to vote. That's not till the 1960s, till the Civil Rights Act. And if we also think about during that time, it's not until after women are regular voters that we get to see some, and even then it's still a hard fight, but you think about women didn't have the right to take out credit in the same ways as men until the 1970s, that you could fire women for being pregnancy from their jobs until the 1960s with the Pregnancy Discrimination Act. The reason that there was a lot of shift in these laws is because women were moved into places of leadership and because women were able to take advantage. So it's like, and if you go down and you talk about the shifts in education law and the shifts in things that are better for the family, a lot of these happened once we moved women into these types of leadership positions. They had a seat at the table and they begin to also put out their, how do things impact women? I mean, we know what happens when there are no women at the table. And I mean, just go look at the Southern Baptist world. And so I mean, it's mind-boggling to me. I'm going to have to jump out of here soon. Are we almost to the end of that?
Did we make it all the way through the 10 minutes? We have like 1 minute left.
Okay, I'll let you finish it, and then
the Alex Clark thing. We got to hear that her end.
Yeah, okay, let me finish it before I say my last thing.
Fine, last clip. Here we go. And again, Beth, I really appreciate you making on such short notice time out of your busy day to respond to this. It is so helpful. It's great. And friends, just to reiterate, Beth's book is out now, Making of Biblical Womanhood. It is a great book. I cannot recommend it highly enough. It's a great audiobook as well. So pick it up wherever you can. Okay, let me pull this final clip here, and then me and Sheila are going to take over here and talk about some other stuff.
I want to hear the rest of it. So
here we go.
So men were basically let off the hook. They were no longer responsible for the common good.
Now, to me, this is the most compelling argument for why women's suffrage may have been a mistake, way more than women being more likely to vote left.
Oh.
What I usually hear when people are talking about this is that is the argument they bring up. Well, look how this was a mistake because women are just more emotional. We're not capable of being rational. And so because of that reason, we are more susceptible to leftist policies. But and while there is an argument for that, I see that. But
I'm sorry, I have to pause here. I have to say just one thing. I cannot. Alex is, I think she's like in her early 20s. I don't think she's married. I don't see a ring on her finger. And like the fact that she can say that while talking about like people who are like her and herself, that, well, you know, women are just more emotional and we're more susceptible to leftist policies is like mind blowing to me. Like it is a mind numbing thing to have someone say that about themselves. I don't know what to say.
Oh, no, I mean, if you look at why women voted against suffrage and worked against suffrage in the 19th and early 20th century, some of them did make a very similar argument that women don't have the mental capacity to do this. I mean, it's mind-boggling, but it is obviously what they have been taught to believe about themselves. And with having this belief, it also then in some ways enables women to claim privileges that they don't do these. And now, as I said, I think the belief is honest here. It's just the self-reflection on what does this actually mean. So anyway, I want to put that, I don't want to discredit. I mean, I honestly believe she probably hears women say that and they probably really believe this.
Yeah. So she's giving in this bit, she's giving two reasons why she thinks women's suffrage was a mistake, right? One is that we're too emotional. And essentially the only reason that women are more emotional is that we've labeled anger not an emotion, because that's why we think men aren't emotional. But anyway, and then there's this other argument that we need to go back to household vote. So she's giving two reasons here why, and she says it, women's suffrage was a mistake. And if you look at the comments on her Instagram reel that came out when she first put that reel up, over and over and over again, you saw women saying, oh yes, they think the vote for women was a mistake. There was a poll going that showed that, you know, hundreds of women thought that the vote for women was a mistake. And so this is what this podcast was saying. That's how she called it. Women's suffrage was a mistake. That's the title of the podcast that Alex Clark put out. She put in the description, women's suffrage was a net negative. She put in the Instagram reel that clip of Nancy Pearcey saying it's net negative. And now she's on Twitter arguing with me saying we never said that. Yep.
All right, there are 30 seconds left in this clip, and then Beth, you're good to roll. Here we go.
Also, what you're saying, I think, it shows a bigger picture of how damaging this was into just, it led into everything, how we split up the family unit and all these other problems. I see it stemming from that one decision.
We went from the idea that the family is an organic structure with a common good. And, you know, common good, of course, everyone benefits from the common good. You know, the good of the family benefits all of us. And it's the same with the church or any other social institution. The good of the whole, benefits all of us.
All right. Well, there we go. That's the final clip. It's all you.
I have two things to say that. First of all, justice benefits everybody. And I think one of the biggest lessons from actually the Black women activists in suffrage is the lift as we climb. And by giving more people access to legal power and being able to have autonomy, it lifts all of us up. And so that understanding seems so absent from this idea of this current anti-suffrage movement. And it's just, that actually is what terrifies me for our society. One of the women that we talk a lot about in my class is a woman named Sophia Singh, who is actually an activist in the UK. And she is a woman who the UK, under Queen Victoria, they actually robbed her of her home. Her father's land was taken away from him in India. He was a prince in India over a large territory, and she and her whole family was essentially grew up in some little bit of, kind of house arrest, although that's not quite the word, in the UK. And she came to a slow acknowledgement about what had happened to her and her family, and what she chose to do with that after becoming aware of some pretty horrific conditions for immigrants in the UK, is that she decided that the way to change society was to help provide more legal access to women and people of color. And she joined the militant suffrage organization. She was there with the Pankhursts and the window smashing campaigns and everything like that. And when she never had children, part of that was because Queen Victoria discouraged her and her siblings from marrying white people because of racism. And so it's another whole horrible story. But she did have a goddaughter. And her goddaughter tells this story about, she remembers every time that she was with Sophia. And Sophia lived actually outside of Hampton Court. She was also a person of privilege. She had a very interesting story, but anyway, but as I said, was this Indian woman. And what Sophia told her goddaughter is, she says, "You are never, ever not to vote. You must promise me you don't know how far we've come." And when I hear women arguing against the vote, I think of Sophia Singh, because they have forgotten how far we've come. And it's terrifying. So Thanks for having me. And I'm going to jump out, and I look forward to hearing Sheila continue on with this clip. So thank you so much. It was very nice meeting you.
Beth, thank you. It was so great having you. Thank you so much. Yeah. We'll talk again soon for sure. I really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
All right, bye. All right, friends. Well, there you go. There's one part of this down. Sheila, how you doing? Can we just take a breather, a little inhale, exhale moment? I mean, it's the first hour has flown by, as it always has. And like I said before we started recording, these long form videos, I love doing them because we can really get in the weeds and kind of unpack claim by claim. Really quick, before we move on, a couple announcements I want to say. Friends, thank you so much for being here, for watching this. We are a nonprofit organization. One of the reasons why I'm able to get stuff out this quickly, literally just a few days ago, I reached out to Sheila and then we got Beth involved, is because people donate to make this work possible. We hold space for thousands of people as they try and navigate a better path forward in their faith, and we do that completely paywall free. All of our Zoom groups, our private Facebook community, all of our content, our podcast is totally accessible to everyone because of the generosity of people like you. If you want to donate or give us a super chat, all donations are tax deductible if they're made inside the US, and they go right to making this work possible. Also, if you like this live, feel free to share it on your social media, to like the actual video, and to subscribe to our channel. We do videos like this pretty often now, responding to all kinds of things. My last one was talking to Keith Giles about universalism. We talked with Pete Enns about deconstruction. We've had Dr. Jennifer Bird on before, responding to sexuality. So we really try and make this a very wide array of bringing on different scholars and different people with expertise to respond to things that we see and we go, maybe there's a better way forward in our faith. So like I said, all donations are tax deductible. They go right to making this work possible. Thank you for being here. So let's keep going. Let's keep diving in, because now, Sheila, we're going to get into kind of your expertise, right?
Yes.
Which is some of the claims that Nancy makes around marriage and how evangelical Christians tend to have the best marriages and maybe by proxy the best sex, etc. Anything you want to preface or add before we start going through some of these clips?
Again, I just want to put this back in the context of her overall argument that she's trying to make, which is that toxic masculinity is a thing. Okay. And she's actually, there are parts of her book and parts of this podcast even that were actually quite good and that I totally agreed with.
Sure.
I think it's almost like she doesn't agree with herself, and she doesn't understand, or deliberately doesn't understand what she's saying, because her argument is that toxic masculinity was a secular thing, not a Christian thing. So all of the things that we think of as toxic masculinity, they were coming through from the secular world. And it's actually Christians who are doing better. And we need to really support Christian men and call them to more. She does a good job of saying that we need to deal with abuse, etc. But her big overall argument is that Christian, evangelical, conservative Christian men do the best of everybody. And so we need to stop talking about Christian men as if they're terrible, and we need to instead emulate these Christian men in society.
I'm sorry, I gotta laugh. Christy goes, has she met John Cooper from Skillet? I'm sorry. John, I've reached out to John Cooper a few times. I actually have his book, ironically, right here. Wimpy, Weak, and Woke. So I do try and read people that I disagree with. I try and understand the arguments, and I reached out to John to have him on the podcast. So, John, if you're watching this, you're more than welcome to hop on. We'd love to talk to you. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a great summary of what's going on. And I want to reiterate to the audience, if you're just joining the live, first off, welcome. Number two, the goal of this is never to dehumanize the folks that we are critiquing. Nancy, Alex, etc. are made in the image of God, and we're not here to belittle them as people. If they're watching this, I hope that they know my door is always open. They can always reach out. We're always happy to have a good faith dialogue and really talk through these things. As I tell my audience often, we are on the same planet. Okay, we're breathing the same air. We are existing together. We have to make this stuff work, and we have to have this conversation. So, okay, I guess you gave me a bunch of small clips to kind of knock out. So we'll just go from the top, and I'll follow your lead on where you want to go. Does that work for you?
Okay.
All right,
sure.
Here we
Let's
go.
do it.
Clip number one.
Let's face it, when people complain that masculinity is toxic, they often point to evangelical men as their prime example. But social science debunks that stereotype. Research shows that committed Christian men who attend church regularly test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers. In fact, they don't want you to know this, but Christianity has the power to overcome toxic behavior in men and reconcile the sexes, an unexpected finding that has stood up to rigorous empirical testing.
Okay, so claim is that, hey, you've heard that there is toxic masculinity in evangelical spaces, but I'm telling you that the empirical data that's stood up to rigorous testing says that's actually not true. The floor is yours.
Okay, and this is the big thing that I want people to get, is that this is the claim. Empirical evidence. And she talks so much about how studies show. So what did we do? We actually looked at the studies. And we've done a deep dive into her research and the claims that she's making. And I would say that they are half true, but true not in the way that she is saying them. And maybe we'll play a couple more clips and I'll get into some of why. But I wanted that to set the stage. She's claiming this is based in evidence.
Okay, sounds good.
We are consistently told that evangelical Christian men are dangerous, that they are oppressive patriarchs prone to abuse, but you actually say that the science proves otherwise.
I was as surprised as anyone because, like everyone else, I've read the accusations. In fact, it was easy to find them online, but I'll give you just one. So this is a quote from the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she said, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today.
And the Church Too movement, would that be like all the Hillsong pastors that were outed, all that? There was like that whole slew of just a ton of pastors all of a sudden?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Yeah. And so, the Me Too moniker, worked really well. So they came up with Church Too. And so the surprising thing is that the social scientists were listening to these accusations and saying, but where's your evidence? You're making these charges, but where's your data? And so they went out and did the studies. And in my book, I quote about a dozen or so studies in which social scientists, so these would be psychologists and sociologists, did the studies and said, actually, Christian men who attend church regularly, who are committed to their faith, actually test out as the most loving and engaged husbands and fathers.
Okay.
They interview the wives.
Okay,
I'm pausing. I'm here.
So she said Christian men who attend church regularly score as the most engaged, et cetera, right? I would agree with that. They actually do. And multiple studies have shown this. Our studies showed this, but it wasn't, I mean, we did a very large survey of 20,000 women for our book, The Great Sex Rescue. And yes, the more religious you are, the better you do. But ours is not the only study that has shown this. The Harvard longitudinal study shows this. Like, multiple studies show that the more religious you are, the better you do. And the Christians tend to do better. But that's not what she's arguing.
Wait, hold on.
Do you remember?
Let me unpack this real quick. When you say engage, because I thought that in the original, like in Alex's trailer, it was that men who are Christian are like the least abusive is kind of the vibe, right? Like, they're not as problematic. It's not as toxic masculinity. But you said that in your studies and in other studies, the more religious men are, the more engaged they are. Are you just saying the same thing differently, or am I missing?
No, that's it. The more religious you are, you tend to be more engaged with your family. The more engaged you are with religion, the more engaged you will be with your family, the better you will be with your family. This is true, but that's not the argument that she's making in her book or in this podcast. And I don't know if you remember it from the very beginning clip that Alex Clark made, but she was saying that it was conservative religious men.
Yes.
It's not conservative religious men that do best. It is Christian men. And there's a difference.
Okay, that's interesting.
This is so let's imagine, okay, that there is a classroom, and that classroom is filled with kids who come from families who hire tutors, who spend like 3 hours a night playing board games with their kids and playing Mozart, and they have piano lessons. And so 28 of the 30 kids in this classroom come from that kind of a home. And 2 of them, you know, their dad is Bubba, and he drinks most of the time, and they watch SpongeBob SquarePants or whatever kids watch these days that is brain dead, right? And now imagine that we find that the kids in this class on average do better than kids in any other classroom in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Can Bubba then claim that his kids do better than any other kids in the United States?
No,
he cannot. But what's happening is that that conservative Christians, so conservative patriarchal Christians who believe in male headship and who act it out, okay, they are claiming that they do better than everyone else. But they are only a very small piece of this pie, and you do not know if you are the piece of the pie that is bringing the average down. Because when studies are done of Christians, they are done of Methodists, of Lutherans, of Catholics, of Eastern Orthodox. They aren't just of evangelicals. So when you see studies of like Christians do well, it's not Southern Baptist Christians who attend an SBC church every Sunday. It's Christians who are involved in some sort of church. And it may not be the conservative patriarchal one.
Okay, this is actually a very important thing to mention. So what you're saying is that the studies that you're talking about that show what you just said, that this is true, are taken from a wider sample than just the SBC church or the ultra reformed or whatever it is. You know, conservative evangelical framework. It's a broader swath of that, a broader swath of Christians that we're talking about. And then the question becomes, you know, are those, you know, whatever, patriarchal, I believe headship and I live it out, can they then claim, oh, look, my Christianity actually is the healthiest expression of what it means to be a man in 2024 America? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. Because one of the studies that's often used is the 2019 world map from the IFS. They had, they didn't have as many as us. I think they had like 12,000 or 16,000 people or whatever. But it was from all over the world. Okay. And if you were to look at Christians compared to non-Christians, you know, you have in your classroom, let's say you have 10 Catholics, you have like 3 Anglicans, you know, a lot of the Catholics are from Peru and Mexico. And then you have like a couple of American Lutherans and maybe one SBC. And that classroom does really well.
Yeah.
But the American SBC was not necessarily bringing that average up or down. And we're going to go into more of the detail where I can tell you whether it does bring it up or down later. But I'm just saying, when you look at surveys of Christians, it doesn't tell you whether conservative patriarchal Christians are doing better, because they are not all Christians.
That is so helpful. And so we're going to unpack if that section brings things up or down. I mean, Heidi sums it up well here. Sheila's point, studies about Christians don't mean only conservative evangelicals. Christians are a bigger group than that. I agree, Heidi. That's really helpful. I also want to mention, I had a really important thought and it just flew away. So let's just keep moving on. That must be a sign from God for me to shut up and let's keep going.
Move to the next clip. I think that one's good enough. Let's move to the next one. I don't know if she
I think it's this one here.
Like I said, in the 19th century, it began to be accepted that men were more secular than women. That they were
I don't remember where this one is. This is
biblical morality didn't have the same hold on their hearts. But it really took a turn with the rise of Darwinian evolution. And this was a bit of a surprise because most people think, wait, that's about science, genes and fossils. But had a huge impact on American concepts of masculinity because Darwinian thinkers began to write that the men who won out in the struggle for survival would be men who were ruthless, barbarian, savage, and predatory.
So if it's coming from Darwinism, then that proves that it's not from Christianity, this idea of toxic masculinity.
Yeah.
Okay, that was the clip. Is that what you wanted to respond to?
Yeah. Okay. So she's making the argument that toxic masculinity came out of Darwinism. Okay. Mm-hmm. And then Alex is saying, so you can't blame it on Christians. Mm-hmm. But this is such a strange argument because we're talking about today. And who cares who started it? What matters is who is continuing it. Mm-hmm. Right? And that book you held up a minute ago, that is a supposed Christian. Right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like who is it? Yes. Who is it that is feeding the toxic masculinity tropes today? Yes, it certainly is in the secular world too. Mm-hmm. But we cannot ignore the fact that it is huge in the Christian world. And they're very, very quick here to blame it all on the secular world and ignore the fact that it is a lot of Christians who are perpetuating this today.
Yeah, I mean, we should also mention this is also historical. Again, I'm going through that book, A Fever in the Heartland, about the KKK, which claimed to be a very Christian Protestant organization. Mm-hmm. They were full of abusive men, who would say one thing on Sunday and then beat their wives later on. And also think about even the SBC, the conservative resurgence, right? Paul Pressler was one of the main architects of that. And horrible accusations of abuse have come out that seem to have been an open secret in the SBC for a long time. And that was in the 70s and 80s. So this dichotomy that, it's the secular Darwinists, which again also minimizes the fact that Christians, many do believe in evolution for good reason, but I digress. But, it's the secular Darwinists who are responsible for toxic masculinity, and it's the Christians who are always pushing for a healthier version of manhood flat out. But it sounds like a false binary to me.
It really is. And as Raymond in the comments said, this didn't start with Darwin. Exactly. Toxic masculinity did not start with Darwin. And also Darwin believed in God, so he wasn't even secular. So the whole thing is really strange. But what they're doing here is they are putting the idea of toxic masculinity in the secular space, not the Christian space. And you just simply can't do that with any intellectual honesty if you look at what's happening right now.
Got it. Christy is saying, is anyone else having issues with the video stalling out? I sure hope not. Everyone's good on my end. So hopefully it's just your personal connection. It's not on my end. But all right, let's go to the next clip. We'll keep going. There's a lot to get to because we have to answer the question. So does this conservative, patriarchal, evangelical thing that we're a part of go up or down?
Let's go.
All right, here we go. This is fun. This is such a good time. I love doing this.
In my book, I go through the social science data where sociologists and psychologists go to ordinary Christians and say, well, what do you think it means? How do you live out the biblical view of headship? And the reason I did that is because the charge is that the doctrine of headship, headship in the home, turns men into overbearing, oppressive tyrants. Well, that's an empirical claim. Does it? So I wanted an empirical answer. Let's look at what it does. When men actually hold these views, do they become overbearing tyrants? And the evidence was absolutely not. I was astonished when I read the actual surveys done and what Christian men and women said when they were asked.
Let's stop it there.
I'm here.
Okay. Now, and this is the heart of her argument, and this is where she goes totally off course. Okay. Mm-hmm. So her argument is this. The secular world is saying that the Christian doctrine of headship is bad and that this idea of men being the protectors and over women is toxic, but actually when you study it, it isn't. Okay? So Tim, if I wanted to know the effects of spanking on kids, would it be better to survey parents who agreed with spanking, or would it be better to survey parents who actually spanked?
Right.
You'd want to look at parents who actually spanked, right? What she basically did was she pulled data from people who agreed with headship, but she didn't look at whether or not you acted out. And here's the thing, okay? The vast, vast majority of Christians who say that they believe that the husband is in charge. And by headship, it's this idea that comes from, they get it from Ephesians 5 and 1 Corinthians 11, that the husband is head of the wife. They think that means authority, even though in Greek, there are several words for head. One does mean authority, similar to what we would say head of a corporation. That is not the word that the Apostle Paul chose to use there. He chose to use a word that is more about source or about unity. And so headship doesn't have an authority base, okay?
Yeah.
But that is what a lot of patriarchal conservative Christians believe. In fact, most people who attend an evangelical church today would say that they believe in male headship. And when you ask them what that means, they will often say, well, it means that the husband, if you just can't agree, the husband makes the decision. So he's the tiebreaker. That's what they figure it means. Okay. Now, in our survey of 20,000 women, we found that 78.9% of couples make decisions together. They just don't ever use that tie-breaking vote, even if they believe in headship. Okay. So it's like you might believe in it, but you don't act it out. And as long as you don't act it out, things are pretty darn good. This is what we need to understand. Okay, before I give you some stats, I want to
ask for clarification on something.
Yeah,
do you mind?
Yeah.
So I want to make sure I heard you correctly. You didn't survey just Christian women, like broadly. You targeted evangelical women, so the folks that we're actually talking about in this, like that we're trying to narrow in on, right? And you were saying that is that correct? Because I'm trying to understand.
We were predominantly evangelical. We did have a lot of other ones just so that we could have a control group and people to compare them to, but we were predominantly evangelical.
I guess what I'm trying to say is I know that one of the critiques earlier was that, hey, the reason why she's using the term Christian is because they surveyed a wider group than just the patriarchal evangelicals. In your survey of 20,000 women, who were you primarily targeting for your research?
It was mostly your conservative evangelicals, but we had a lot of others too.
That's
like we did have,
really
we had enough to make statistically significant comparisons.
Cool. So. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I understood maybe the difference here. And so you're saying that even though 78% of people you might have surveyed said that they agreed with some form of this headship thing, they didn't actually live it out in the sense of what you're describing.
79% did not live it out. I forget how many actually agreed with it. Like the majority did, but the vast majority of Christians, even in the evangelical world, don't live it out. Okay, let me back up again. I'm going to give you another thought.
Sure.
I'm in Canada. Okay, Canada's freezing. And let's say that I worked for a public health department and I wanted to figure out, hey, how can we get Canadians to stay healthier in the winter when you don't want to go out and exercise? So I'm going to do a study on whether or not fresh air helps Canadians feel better. And so we ask people, how often do you go outside every day? And what we find is that if you go outside like 2 or 3 times, people tend to be really healthy. But the more often people go outside, the less healthy they get. And so it's like, wow, well, maybe we should tell people to stay indoors. Now, what's going on here is that there's actually something called a confounding variable. And that means that there's something else affecting our outcomes that we're not measuring because we haven't thought of it or we haven't put it in our model. So in this case, what we're not measuring is the effects of smoking. Because who is it that goes outside 8 times a day in the winter? Heavy smokers, right? And smoking is so bad for your health that you only need a few heavy smokers in your population to really influence the results down. Okay.
Right. Okay.
Religiosity works in a very similar way, but opposite. Religiosity is so overwhelmingly positive that when people attend church, when they're part of a faith community, think about it. If you need to move and you belong to a church, you'll have 30 guys show up as long as you give them pizza, right? If you're my daughter is about to have My daughter's about to have a baby, my youngest, and like she had 2 showers. She had so much stuff. We had to make baskets to give to the pregnancy crisis centers, because she was just overwhelmed with gifts. Like, this is what happens when you're part of a community, a faith community. Often is there's just overwhelming benefits to it. You have friends, you have people who look after you, you have mentors, you have a purpose in your life, you have Jesus. All these things are great. Okay.
Sure.
It just so happens that in America, if you're going to be highly religious, you're going to tend to go to a conservative evangelical church. And so when we see results about how people who attend conservative evangelical churches are doing better than the general population, that may very well be true, but it isn't because they're conservative. It's because they're attending church.
It's just attending church is just that powerful of
Yes.
a life benefits that it can even overshadow some of the more toxic elements of these conservative spaces. Is that kind of the general idea here?
Exactly. So we had statistically significant results from 6 different nations. All right, for our survey of 20,000. The healthiest nation was New Zealand. Okay, like in terms of marital and sexual satisfaction. So the New Zealand, UK, Australia, Canada, the US, South Africa. That's the order of it.
Wow.
Basically, the more conservative you are, the less healthy you are. The more in favor of gender equality you are, the healthier you are. So it's not that conservative patriarchal people are the healthiest. It's just simply that in America, conservative evangelicals tend to go to church more.
Can I make a point about this that's so important? I think this is helpful because I often have wrestled with what you said, that, hey, the evidence does support that high religiosity is really a benefiting, it's very beneficial to your life. Yet I deal in a space, and so do you, right, where we're part of this deconstruction thing where so many people, I'm sure you get the DMs too, are telling you about their terrible church experience that hurt, especially for women, that really messed them up. And I'm like, okay, I don't want to go just off of my experience and what I've been told that might not be, proven in data. But at the same time, how do I account for these variables then of like getting quite literally tens of thousands of DMs or people saying, yeah, this happened to me. And like my friend Dan says, it's like going to a hospital and getting injured, right? You expect to go to a place that's going to be life-giving. And instead you come out with you're missing a leg or something like that. So this is helpful to kind of distinguish the layers between high religiosity actually is very life-giving, but also there can be very unhealthy expressions of it that can taint the actual result.
Exactly. And that's what we found. This is our second big book, She Deserves Better. So we did a second survey, I got to move the other way, of 7,000 women for this one, looking at how their experiences in church affected them long-term. And what we found, again, is that kids who went to youth group tended to do better. Okay. Until they internalized a lot of the toxic teachings about modesty, about consent, etc. And then it actually would have been better for them in terms of future marital health, in terms of self-esteem, etc., not to have gone to church at all. So it's like as soon as you internalize toxic stuff, then the benefits of religiosity disappear. And this is what Nancy Pearcey is not admitting, because she's taking the credit for religiosity, but she's not admitting what happens when you actually act out headship. And in that clip we just watched, I don't know what the next clip is because I actually want to go into some of the stuff she studied about headship because it's so off base. Do you want to play the next one? And if it's not what I think it is, I'll make you stop and I'll tell my point. But
the audience, listen, let me just show really quick. I mean, Daniel says super content. Well done. The audience is here for it. I'm here for it. It sounds like, to really maybe potentially oversimplify, I don't mean to, but to sum up what you're saying, these things like patriarchy and what you just cited are more like contaminants in what can be a very good thing, right?
Exactly.
Like they're not actually the benefit, they're actually the problem to what makes a healthy religious experience healthy. Is that a fair way of saying it?
Yeah, actually, I will say it before you put the next clip on, because what she was saying in the clip that we watched is they asked couples what headship meant to them. Okay. Now, what she's referring to is a study that was done by a sociologist named Sally Gallagher in 2002. And she wrote like the textbook. It's just an incredible book on how evangelicals do gender. And it's based on information from the late 90s. Nancy Pearcey portrays this as if it's today. She says the word today, couples say this multiple times when referring to this research, which was done before my youngest child was born, and my youngest child is now about to deliver a baby. So I find this problematic as a scholar. This is very poor scholarship, but nevertheless, what Sally Gallagher found is that the majority of Christians, and again, this is late 90s, say they believe in headship, okay? But what they actually practice is pragmatic egalitarianism. So they believe in symbolic headship, but they don't practice it. They practice egalitarianism. And she said for most Christians, the idea of headship is more like virtue signaling. It's more like saying this is how we do marriage different from the world than actually doing marriage different from the world.
I just want to give an anecdotal piece of evidence for that. That is my parents. My parents, my dad and mom would say exactly this. We believe in headship and whatever, but they've had an amazing marriage for 30 something years, and it is very much egalitarian in practice. Like, they both have different roles. They both complement each other. They make decisions together. So I think, and my parents are, I would say, very conservative in that sense, but, inheritance is everything, but pragmatically they tend to live out exactly what you're talking about. So, yeah.
And this is the argument that Nancy Pearcey makes is this: because people who say they believe in headship don't act it out, therefore it's fine to believe in headship. Therefore, we can say that the people who believe in headship do fine. No, Nancy, we can't. And I'll tell you why. I forget which, the John Gottman, the one where I have the John Gottman results of 81%.
Okay. Yeah, I got that.
Can you
right
put
here.
that slide up there?
Boom.
Okay. When we act out complementarianism, okay, when we actually act out the man having the tie-breaking vote, the man getting to decide things, John Gottman, who's the world's premier marriage researcher, okay, he found an 81% chance of divorce.
Wow.
So acting out the man being in charge has an 81% chance of divorce. In the Great Sex Rescue, we were measuring things slightly differently. We couldn't look at chance of divorce or a chance that an individual marriage will eventually end in divorce. But we did find that if you act this out with the guy being in charge, you have a 7.4 times higher divorce rate.
That's what you say here.
So that's like huge, right?
That's
now,
big.
Nancy Pearcey quotes John Gottman from the very chapter in his book, 7 Principles for Making Marriage Work, where he said that when men don't share power, when they make the decisions, there's an 81% chance of divorce, okay? She quotes from that very chapter. But later in that chapter, what John Gottman says is most men who are religious who believe this don't act it out. And as long as you are emotionally healthy, it doesn't matter whether you believe in male authority or not, as long as you don't act it out. And so she quotes him as saying, it doesn't matter whether you believe in it or not. You're equally healthy. And it's like, no, Nancy, you can't quote that. You can't quote that quote without acknowledging that Gottman's point was when you acted out, bad things happen.
I mean, here it is. I found the quote from the Gottman Institute. Even in the first few months of marriage, men who allow their wives to influence them have happier marriages and are less likely to divorce than men who resist their wives' influence. Statistically speaking, when a man is not willing to share power with his partner, there's an 81% chance that his marriage will self-destruct. This makes complete sense. Sense.
Exactly. And then a couple of pages later, he's talking about how most religious men don't actually act this out. And if you don't, you can be equally emotionally healthy. And so Nancy Pearcey's point is, look, whether you're conservative or progressive in terms of what you think of gender roles, Gottman says you can be equally emotionally healthy. But Gottman said that's only true if you don't act it out.
Right.
And that's what she never, ever acknowledges, is that acting this out is really, really awful.
Yeah, that's really good. All right, shall we keep going? Friends,
yes,
this is
keep
great.
Going.
Sheila, you're putting on a masterclass. This is one of my favorite lives. We had Beth Allison Barr on earlier talking about women's suffrage. So we're talking about this. I love this. This is great. All right, next clip. I think we're here.
What does headship mean?
Oh, wait, we finished this one already. Let's keep going.
Yeah, you can skip this
Christian
one.
couples are the least likely to divorce, 35% less likely to divorce than secular couples. And then finally, they have the lowest rates of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America.
I'm going to play that clip one more time for the audience, make sure they got all of that, and then I'll have your response, Sheila.
Less likely.
Okay.
Here we go.
Christian couples are the least likely to divorce, 35% less likely to divorce than secular couples. And then finally, they have the lowest rates of domestic abuse and violence of any major group in America.
Okay, so the claim is that Christians are less likely to divorce and have lower rates of domestic violence. The floor is yours.
Okay. Overall, it is true that those who attend church have lower rates of divorce. Okay.
Great.
That does not mean that conservative Christians have lower rates of divorce. But let me ask you another question. Do rates of divorce really matter? What is a better measure? Because to me, a marriage staying together that is absolutely horrible and abusive is not a success. And so the real question is, what is the quality of the marriage in these groups? And in conservative religious spaces, you are not allowed to divorce for abuse. Focus on the Family does not condone divorce for abuse. John MacArthur sends women back to abusive husbands.
Yes, he does.
John Piper's church excommunicated Natalie Hoffman, who divorced her abusive spouse. You know, we hear about these things.
And John MacArthur excommunicated Eileen Gray.
Yes, whose husband was a pedophile, right? We hear about this over and over again. And so women in these spaces are not able to divorce. So just because the divorce rate is low does not mean the marriages are good. And that's a huge issue. I have a theory. Do you want to hear my theory? This is like totally a tangent, but you want to hear my theory?
As long as we're clear, it's just a theory.
It's a hot take. It's a
hot take. Hot take.
Okay. So in the 60s and early 70s, across the United States, no-fault divorce came in the States one by one. And what you saw was the divorce rate skyrocketing, because as soon as no-fault divorce came in, there was pent-up demand, right? There were all these people who were miserable that weren't in good marriages, and suddenly they could get out of them, and they did in large numbers. And the divorce rate has been falling ever since. There was a slight uptick during COVID, and now it's back down again. So ever since the late 70s, the divorce rate has actually been falling. So every time a Christian pastor says, look at how terrible everything is, and the divorce rate is increasing. No, it's not. It's been falling since the late 70s. Okay. I think that similar huge upward trend of divorces, I think we're going to start seeing that in the conservative evangelical church over the next 10 years, because there's a huge pent up demand for divorce, because there are so many women, especially in abusive marriages. And up until now, they haven't been allowed to leave those marriages. But increasingly, there's groups like this online. There's Bear Marriage, where I'm from, bearmarriage.com, Bear Marriage Podcast. There's so many amazing abuse advocates talking about how God does not expect you to stay in an abusive marriage. And I think we're going to see a huge uptick in divorce.
No, I think that is a very, I think there was someone on Twitter, a pastor, who kind of cited these things and like kind of spelt them out the same way.
Josh Howardson did.
Yes,
Josh Howardson did.
I didn't want to say the name, but I'll say it. He actually has me blocked on Instagram. So Josh, if you're watching this, please don't block me and talk to me. I promise I'm not going to bite your head off. But he kind of made this whole post of like why evangelical conservatives are doing it the best. Like he didn't account for the broader Christian thought. And the first thing I thought was, I grew up in a culture that said if you got divorced, you were sometimes kicked out, you were shamed upon. I could see why conservative evangelicals wouldn't have as high of a divorce rate, because it's so looked down upon. But that's not a good indication of the marriage automatically being healthy or equal, or one partner being happy in it. I just don't think that's an automatic equation for that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, exactly. And then the second thing that she said was that abuse is lower. This is iffy. We have tried to measure this a lot. What scholars have said is that while the instance of abuse may be similar in Christian and non-Christian spaces, Christians put up with it for longer. And so it's more detrimental when it happens in a Christian marriage, because we have societal forces telling us to stay. Yep. And we have a lot of religious guilt. And so it often hits religious women worse. And religious women tend to stay longer in abusive marriages. One of the sociologists that Nancy Pearcey quotes almost exclusively in all of her work is a guy named Brad Wilcox. Yeah. And Brad Wilcox was one of the authors on a huge study out of the Institute for Family Studies in 2019, where they looked at divorce. Well, they looked at multiple things about marriage, but one of them was divorce. And they divided everybody into 6 categories, okay? Highly religious. So both people are highly religious. They attend church a lot. Mid-religious, where maybe one person is religious, but the other isn't, or they just don't attend church that often. And then totally non-religious. So that's 3. And then within each of those 3 groups, they divided people, whether you believed in male headship and whether you believed that, the husband was in charge and you were more patriarchal, or whether you were egalitarian. And that led to 6 groups. Okay. Mm-hmm. when you look at abuse, the men who reported, I think it was 27% of men who were not religious but believed in male headship said that they had been abusive in their current relationship. So that was, out of the 6, that was the worst. So non-religious men who believed in male headship.
Got it.
Okay. The second worst was religious men who believed in male headship. And a quarter of them admitted to abusing their current.
So 2% difference, 27%, 25%.
Yeah. The best of all of those 6 were religious men who were egalitarian. Okay. So it's like, yes, there are men who are not as abusive and tend to be Christian, but not the ones that Nancy's talking about, because her whole book is saying that, men who are complementarian do amazing and they make amazing husbands. And that's only true if they don't act it out.
Right.
And if the theology only works if you don't act it out, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for that theology.
Yeah. Makes complete sense.
Okay, next clip.
Next clip. This is great. Next one is titled Better Sex. Ooh, let's see what they have to say.
Okay.
So this was an article in the New York Times, and he said, it turns out, direct quote, it turns out that 73% of women who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands report high-quality marriages. And here's how he puts it. The happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. So
I did see some survey recently that said that conservative Christian women are having better sex.
Oh, that's in my book too.
Okay, so this is actually important, right? Because now Nancy is focusing in on conservative, evangelical Christian women, and the claim is that they have, I guess, a better marriage, and also they're having really good sex. Okay, what are your thoughts here?
Yes. Now, when she says that this was an article in the New York Times, what she's not telling you is that article was written by Brad Wilcox from the Institute for Family Studies. So he is a conservative religious person. Okay. Because when you say it's by the New York Times, it makes it sound like it's this secular impartial thing, and it's not.
Yeah.
Okay. Again, it depends. When you're only measuring belief, then yes, conservative men do well. But when you actually measure whether they acted out, things do really badly. And that's part of the thing we're trying to say. Now let's turn to sex, because this one's kind of interesting. Okay. I think I have a chart, a book, or a slide on this.
I have 2
about the orgasm rates.
I got
Do
that
we have
one.
that one?
This
Okay.
one.
What happens with sex when you act out complementarianism? So when you're in a marriage where the husband makes that final decision, and when you actually act it out, okay? 40.2% of women who act out complementarianism almost always reach orgasm in a given sexual encounter. 95% of men do. So that's a 55-point orgasm gap.
I see.
Okay, 51.7% of women who act out egalitarianism almost always reach orgasm. So it's still pretty lousy. We have a lot of work to do on the orgasm gap.
I gotta say, I wasn't that impressed by the egalitarianism one. I'm like, only 51%.
It's still lousy.
Jeez.
But that's a 12-point difference in the orgasm gap.
Sure.
Okay, so you can't argue that men who are conservative and who act out headship do better, because they don't.
And yours is the biggest study. That needs to be said here. Like, you did the biggest study on this topic to date. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did. And we're trying to distinguish between those who say they believe it and those who act it out. Because we said, like Sally Gallagher said in 2002, most people who believe it don't act it out. And so what good is it to just simply ask people what they believe?
Totally.
Right? Totally. Okay, let's look at the anorgasmia study.
I got that one too.
I have that one too.
I got that one for you.
Okay, so 10% of women who practice egalitarianism never reach orgasm, compared to 16.7% of those who live out male authority. So it really affects your orgasm rate, and obligation sex messages and modesty messages are also highly correlated with sexual pain. It really, really bothers me. This is just a pet peeve, but when people talk about how Christians have such better sex and they don't mention how terrible our rates are of sexual pain, that just guts me, because Evangelical women have 2 to 2.5 times the rate of sexual pain as the general population. We're at 22.7% of women experiencing vaginismus, 7% to the point that penetration is impossible. This is a huge issue, and this is largely our issue. And so it really bugs me when Christians brag about how great our sex lives are, and we don't even mention the extraordinary incidence of sexual pain among evangelical women. And those can largely, we've studied this at length, and it can largely be traced back to the obligation sex message that you're obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it, and the modesty messages given to teenage girls.
Yeah. When I first started doing TNE and I asked the purity question and the, just thoughts, and most of our followers, especially on Instagram, are women, and some of the stories were just shocking. And I've heard that all too often. And it's helpful to hear your data on this because, I'm obviously in a certain corner of the internet, with certain people that have a certain experience, and that's a legit thing. But you always wonder, broadly speaking, is this indicative of the whole? So, your research is helpful in that way of just confirming some things and knowing that we can do better.
And get the Great Sex Rescue if you've had sexual pain, because we go into detail on how to handle that and why that may have happened. So, yeah.
Great. All right, well, keep going. Here we go.
Okay, here we go.
Some people have asked me, well, why would they be worse than secular men? And apparently it's this, they feel religious justification for the way they're acting.
Oh, okay. So here, I should have backed this one up. So what she's saying is that nominal Christian men, so men who aren't quite as committed to going to church. So they do go to church, but not as often. They are actually the most abusive. They're even worse than secular men. So the men who are actually abusive, she says, are not the totally committed Christians. They're just the nominal Christians. And now she's explaining why.
Okay, here we go.
And some people have asked me, well, why would they be worse than secular men? And apparently it's this, they feel religious justification for the way they're acting. So that the average secular guy who's maybe hitting his wife and kids doesn't feel any religious justification for that. But the nominal Christian has hung around the fringes of the Christian world enough to pick up language like headship and submission and will justify his abuse by using Christian language and feel like, well, I'm the head.
I mean, that's, well, you go first. I'll have my thoughts after you.
Okay, so the point that she's making is you can't blame Christian men for abuse because it's actually nominal Christian men. It's the guys who aren't that committed who are abusing. Right. I'm sorry, Nancy, but if people are using the words of headship and submission to justify abuse, that is a problem.
This is the argument here all the time. Oh, they're not real Christians. It's like, really? Mm-hmm. Interesting. They profess to be. They say all the right things. Yeah. They attend your church every now and then. They probably tithe. And also they pick up on the language. So they're obviously in the circle enough to pick up on language. And the answer is, well, they're not committed enough to what? Patriarchy? To what? Right. Like you've distinguished now many times, the difference between believing something versus acting out on it. The evidence that you're talking about seems to indicate that when you actually believe and then act out this complementarian belief system, it actually does a lot of harm to people. So I don't understand then. So I don't understand, I guess, Nancy's point here of, are these people really committed who actually believe this stuff, or are they just, oh, I passed the church one day and her complementarian and now I'm an abusive husband? I don't understand.
Okay, this is a bigger problem that I have with her scholarship because, and we did a podcast on this back in September, the Bare Marriage podcast. I think it's episode 202. But, we looked at her footnotes and the studies that she cited, and she never did a proper literature review. Like if I'm going to look at, hey, how do religious beliefs impact abuse? There are so many articles on that have been written in the last few years. She didn't include them. So for instance, there's a really big article on how beliefs in Calvinism correlate with beliefs in rape culture myths.
That I believe.
The more you believe in Calvinism, the more you believe in rape culture myths, and the more you believe in justification for abuse. And there's just a lot out there that now supports that. It is difficult to measure abuse. We had a hard time with it because once you ask questions about abuse on surveys, like you get into ethical dilemmas with university ethics approval, which is proper. It's tricky to do. But it boggles my mind that she cherry picked so much. And she ignores the real crises that are often happening in Christian marriages.
Listen, I don't want to speak out of turn here because you're the expert, not me. But I mean, it's not a stretch for me to imagine that if I believe as a man, I have a special calling by God to lead and be in charge over my family. I could easily see how that belief system, if acted out, can lead to very unhealthy tendencies, right? Where I feel like I have a special authority that my partner does not when it comes to our finances, how we raise our kids, how we do certain things, even her body, bodily autonomy when it comes to sex and things like that. It's not a stretch to imagine how dangerous this can get. And then you think about I'm not going to rehash them all here, but the story after story, right, of those spaces and leaders in those spaces being found out to do some pretty terrible things, like John MacArthur, like John Piper, Paul Pressler, the SBC. I mean, we can get Mark Driscoll, we can go Ravi Zacharias, we can go down the list, and that's not including the pastors that no one knows about or the leaders that no one knows about, right? And so, like, it is very plausible, and then you can look at just some of the headlines and see a connection. I'm not saying correlation equals causation here automatically, but it's not hard to put two and two together in that sense. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. And that's what we have found repeatedly in our surveys, is that these beliefs, we call them toxic teachings, right? These beliefs about male entitlement to female bodies, about male entitlement to sex, about, and acting out leadership, that these are highly correlated with really lousy stuff in marriage. Let me give you an interesting one. And this is about teenagers. So if you go to a church that heavily teaches the modesty message, right? That girls are stumbling blocks to the boys around them, so they have to watch what they wear, that boys struggle with lust in a way that girls will never understand, that boys are visual in a way that girls will never understand. If you go to a church that teaches that, she is like way more likely, I forget the exact stat, but it's a significant jump. She is way more likely to be sexually abused in that church as a teenager. Or sexually harassed than in a church that doesn't teach that. So when we teach this toxic stuff, we actually do open up girls and women and boys too, to be abused. And we're seeing that in our stats. And so but again, her point is it's not real Christians. The Christians who believe in headship are doing great. No, Nancy, you can't claim belief in headship is okay if it's only okay if you don't act it out.
Right. All right, we'll keep moving through these. We're getting there. Friends, thank you for being here. I love having you on this conversation live. And if you're listening to this on podcast, thank you for tuning in. We'll keep it going. Here we go.
Who do you think has it worse in America today, women or white Christian men?
Well, I'll tell you what the surveys show.
Okay, hold on. I just want to point out that that's quite the question. But now Nancy is claiming that this is what the data, the surveys show. So she's positioning herself as an authority on someone who's read the research and has done whatever she has done to be a credible voice on this. Let's see what she has to say. If women or if white Christian men have it worse in America.
The surveys show men. The surveys show, at least men think so. There have been surveys in which they were asked, do you agree with this statement? Today, discrimination against men has become as bad as discrimination against women. And in surveys, men say yes. They think that discrimination against men has become as big of a problem as discrimination against women. And they were asked sometimes, I have several surveys in my book, and so another one did ask, do men have it harder now or women? And a lot of men said, yeah, we think men have it harder now.
I just got to point out, it's very interesting that the surveys she's citing are ones where they asked men their perception of how they feel about things, and somehow that's the empirical data that men actually have it worse. I'm sorry, Christian men have it worse than women do. I mean, I'm already kind of flabbergasted that this is like the empirical data we're talking about here, because, I mean, frankly, as a white, straight Christian man, we are complete babies so often, we cry about everything. So it's just very interesting because it's like, does that actually prove though that you actually do have it harder in America? Yep. I don't think it does. So
let's talk about what this empirically proves. Assuming that this survey was done well and that it is representative of the population, all we know is that the men who took the survey think that they are hard done by. It does not tell us if men actually are hard done by, because it hasn't measured the actual. Yeah, like are men worse off And so I just find this, I find this amazing that she is willing to listen to men's opinions on gender equality, but not on women's.
Right. And I do want to point out here, and Sheila, I'm sure you agree with me, there are some stats about men and depression and them unaliving themselves at higher rates. Like there are things that certainly are concerning that this is not an anti-men claim here that all men are like this. We're just pointing out that like it's interesting that the source of the data is men's perception of, well, again, this study's perception of those things.
Okay, can I do a shout out on that note?
Please.
Can I do a shout out for this book? This is by Carolyn Custis James, the book Maelstrom. And what it is looking at is the effects of patriarchy on men. Okay, so I would agree. Men are falling behind educationally. Men are lonelier. On a lot of social measures, men are falling behind. That isn't because of women. The same reasons that men are falling behind are the same reasons that women are abused, that marriages are falling apart. It's the same root cause, and it's patriarchy. When you raise men in a society where they can't, they're not allowed to get in touch with their feelings, where they're not emotionally healthy, where they don't know how to emotionally regulate, where they only have worth if they are at the top of the pile and if they're the alpha dog, and they don't have any worth if they're not super sportsy or whatever, or if they don't make a lot of money, then yes, men are going to fall back. But that's not women's fault. That's the same root as all of these other ills, which is patriarchy. It's the same problem. And so yes, men are falling behind, but the way to solve that is to address the root issue, which is patriarchy. It's not to complain that women have it too good now.
Can you hold that book up again so the audience can see it? They want to know who the author is.
Okay, this is hard because like it's the opposite way for me, but Carolyn Custis James.
Great. Yeah. I really appreciate you pointing that out. Again, I think that in a world of extremes, right, people can think, oh, this is about, you hate men. Of course we don't. I'm a man. No, we don't hate men. In fact, and those studies should be concerning, right? If the data does show that, okay, this is happening to men, we should ask why, what's going on. And to your point, that doesn't mean it's women's fault or that it's feminism's fault. There's something deeper going on. And I honestly, as a man, Sheila, frankly, I resonate with many of the things that you said about, being conditioned not to be able to show my emotions, feeling like if I cry in front of someone, I'm a weak person. So I can totally relate to that for sure. I think it's really worth pointing out, as well as the sense of loneliness we have, being, again, conditioned that as a man, I have to be this alpha dog that, is an independent own island who you can't have any friends and be vulnerable with them. That definitely affects my well-being 100%. All right, let's finish up this clip and then we'll keep going.
And I quote a psychotherapist who writes regularly for the Wall Street Journal. In fact, you've had her on here, Erica Commissar.
Love Erica. One of my most favorite guests I've ever had, and one of my audience's most favorite guests I've ever had.
Well, she said, I have a quote from her in my book, because she said, especially young men. She said, young men coming into my practice are feeling defeated, demoralized, depressed, because they feel like they're growing up in a culture that's hostile to masculinity.
Okay. You got any thoughts on that?
Let's face it, when
sorry.
people
complain. We'll get back to you. There you
go. They are growing up in a culture that is hostile to what they were taught was masculinity. And it is hard when you're going through social change. But the problem is that they have been given a script that doesn't work anymore. Men have been given a script that doesn't work. In fact, it never really worked, but you could manage to eke it out when you had privilege and you could just push through. But now that you can compete with women, it doesn't work anymore. Halo 3, can I tell you about the Halo 3 study? I love the Halo 3 study.
Yeah, please.
Okay.
Drop all the studies.
A couple of years ago, some researchers did a study on the video game Halo 3, which is a multiplayer game, and they used female voiced players. So I don't know if the players themselves were female, but like it looked like to all the other players, it looked like these were women. Okay. And what they found is that men who were really good at Halo 3 did not have a problem with the female players. But men who really sucked at Halo 3 were really misogynist towards the female players. And so females are a risk if you're not very skilled and if you're insecure. And I just wonder how much of all these guys railing against feminism are really worried about what's going to happen if I have to compete on a level playing field, because I'm not going to be able to. And there's a lot of young men who, they're not doing well, and the suicide rates are really high and the loneliness rates are really high, but it's because they haven't been given the right scripts about what it means to be emotionally healthy, about what success means in life. If you're taught that you're only worth something if you're at the top of the pile, then it's going to be hard to live in this society.
And might I even be so bold to argue that, a high Christian ethic that would fight against things like capitalism and fight for the last shall be first can actually be really healthy, right? To a healthy masculine identity that wants to behave in ways and wants to think about things in those ways. I mean, I think there's, and that kind of maybe gets back to the idea that religiosity is a really life-giving thing in general. It's when it's lumped in with these like really toxic elements, right? Patriarchy, etc., where things kind of go awry. But I think that there are tons in the Christian tradition in particular of beautiful, really healthy teachings that could, like to your point, help men recalibrate to think about things in a healthier way overall. And I say that as someone who has done a lot of that work myself.
And that's my big problem with what Nancy is saying, is because she's taking the benefits of healthy Christianity. And she is saying, see, you can get these benefits even if you practice this toxic form of it.
Right.
Even if you believe this toxic form of it. And no, you can't claim the benefits of a different form of Christianity than the one that you are putting forward. It doesn't work that way.
I love that. Okay, you have a clip here said where we agree. So let's look at some overlapping agreement that you and Nancy have together. Here we go.
So, for example, we probably think the concept of toxic masculinity rose out of second wave feminism, 1960s.
Yeah, that's what I assumed.
Right, and it goes
this is a good clip.
further back. Let's get the big picture. The big picture is it goes back to the Industrial Revolution. Before that time, most men worked alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business, and so the cultural expectation of men focused much more on their caretaking role. In fact, here's an interesting historical fact. Most books and literature on parenting was addressed to fathers, not to mothers. If you go in a bookstore today, most of them are addressed to mothers. But fathers were considered the primary parent, and they did, in fact, spend as much time with their children as mothers did, which is hard for us to even imagine. But especially their sons. Their sons were practically apprentices working alongside them in their trade or their craft. And so where did we lose all that?
Do you want me to pause here?
I think, and this is something that she says in her book, this is something she says in the interview, which I think is really important, which is, we lost something when the family splintered with the Industrial Revolution. Now, we also gained a lot. Like, we got lifted out of poverty. People aren't worried about their next meal anymore. I don't want to, I'm not trying to bemoan all progress, but we did lose something. And in her book, she talks about how to regain the father as a big part of the family, because it was seen as like the kids in the home were now the woman's domain and work was the man's domain. And he was really separate from the kids. And so a lot of her book is inviting men to be back involved with the family, which is great.
100%.
I just find it really too bad that the way she does that is to pair it with a conservative patriarchal view of Christianity, which we know doesn't work.
Well, it also feels to me very self-defeating, and this is a broader theme I'm going to pick up on. This is a Turning Point USA powered podcast to kind of reinforce. I mean, the context of a lot of this is that women's suffrage was a net loss, and evangelical conservative theology is so good. But I really agree heavy with Nancy on this. In fact, I've actually been to some of these spaces, Sheila. I've been to America Fest. I've talked to a lot of these people privately behind the scenes over a drink. And I've told them, guys, I'm all about being pro-family, which is why I don't understand how you can't be in favor of fair wages and a higher living wage and really making corporations pay their fair share, because the Industrial Revolution, I mean, yes, maybe did a lot of good, but make no mistake, right? We're still struggling with food insecurity for a lot of Americans. Wages have not risen overall when it comes to the average American worker. It's very little. We still can't get affordable wages. Now, it's not uncommon for two parents that need to work outside the home, right? And which does take away from that family time. So I'm actually actually completely in agreement that, like, yes, like there is I'm going to argue a capitalistic model to this where corporations have a top priority of profit for shareholders at the expense of the worker, which then does devalue how much time dad does have with the kids, right? I mean, again, I think about it often where my dad, a blue collar worker, literally broke his back for our family, worked incredibly hard to put food on the table, and I'm so grateful for that. But he wasn't home during the day, and when he came home, he was tired. Can I blame him? He was on a job site, rolling walls and painting all day and doing construction, but he had to do that to make things work. And so I just think, like, I see the overlap in these moments, and I go, yet so often we diverge, in particular with folks like Charlie Kirk and Turning Point, when their take on bringing the family unit back is like, it just seems not to really solve the problem. It seems to be more of a culture thing instead of realizing that we actually have a system deeply embedded in the American psyche that tends to really favor the profits of companies that don't actually exist. A corporation is not a sentient being, at the expense of their workers. We still can't get affordable health care. If someone has any kind of government subsidy, it's seen as they're lazy and poor. All those things are reinforced by organizations like Turning Point USA. So that part does drive me absolutely crazy.
Yeah, and as a Canadian, I just can't get over your lack of mat leave. I mean, for pity's sake, my oldest was born 29 years ago. I had a year off.
Are you kidding me?
29 years ago.
Don't tell me that. So depressing.
Like, that's just normal in every other industrialized country in the world.
One of my biggest scares as someone who runs a very small nonprofit is what happens when I can't afford my healthcare anymore, because I have to go through the government marketplace and it's subsidized because I only make so much money. But if I make any like $1 over that, all of a sudden my healthcare is like $800 a month plus my deductible plus my co-pays. Like, it's crazy,
right.
And so I think, again, I always ask people in this space, like, help me understand how these kinds of policies are pro-family. I agree. Yeah. Mom and dad should be with the kids more. That's a healthy thing. So can we take some of the financial burden and stress away from them and give them some kind of healthcare security and maternity leave and maybe even childcare? No, that's socialism. Oh my God. Like, you can't have your cake and eat it too,
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, I know. I don't. Are we out of clips? Because I had two more things I wanted to say.
No,
is that the last?
I have one on the. Oh, I have one clip I pulled on the red pill. I wanted to point out an agreement there too. But yeah, this is all I have.
Okay. Can you throw out the rose-colored glasses one? I didn't bring up this point, but I want to explain this point. Is it it's one of the slides I sent you on rose-colored glasses.
Is it this one?
Yes. Okay.
Boom. Look at me go.
Let me explain this. So the other issue with the claim that conservative Christian women who believe in male hierarchy do better is, how do we define do better? Okay. Because most surveys say, hey, do you like your marriage? Right? Now, the thing is, if you believe in male hierarchy and you're a really conservative Christian, you think marriage is your main thing in life, right? Because this is what you've been told. Your most important role is as a wife, and marriage is vitally important. And so, of course, you're going to like your marriage, because I mean, if you don't, then that's your entire thing. And again, Nancy Pearcey quotes Brad Wilcox a lot. Brad Wilcox actually talks about this, how it is possible that maybe the reason that conservative women's marital satisfaction rates are so high is because of something called the rose-colored glasses effect. Well, we measured it. Okay. We actually put numbers to the rose-colored glasses effect in our survey. So there's two different ways you can ask people if they're happy. You can say, hey, are you happy? Right? Or you can say something like, when you are in an argument with your husband, do you feel like he understands your point of view? Okay. So one is like a global measure and one is a specific measure. And what we find is that when you believe in this male headship, this complementarian view, okay, you're 35% more likely to have higher global marital satisfaction. So you're going to say, yeah, I totally love my marriage, right? But, and I forget what the number is, you're going to have to put it back up there. You're 33%, I think it's 33%. Yeah, you're 35%, or I got it wrong. You're 33% more likely to have higher global Okay. But you're 35% more likely to have below average specific marital satisfaction. So ask them, how's your marriage? They're more likely to say it's great. Ask them, does your husband listen to you? Do you spend time together? They're more likely to say no. So when you actually look at the specifics, it ain't as good.
That ties into this clip, actually. Do you have anything else you want to add to this?
Just one more. I just want to say this
please.
next one.
Yes.
I think this
Take your
is
time.
hilarious.
Go ahead.
For the next one, we looked only at women who never reach orgasm. Okay, so they never ever reach orgasm. And we said, we asked all women this, but just for this particular stat, we only ran the women who never reach orgasm. And we said, hey, are you happy with the amount that you orgasm, with the frequency of the orgasm? Women who never do. Okay. If you believe in complementarianism, you're 22% more likely to say, yes, I am happy. So wow. I don't reach orgasm, but I'm happy. Because why? Because they're told that sex is primarily about how happy their husbands are and how frequently they're having sex. So this is the rose-colored glasses effect. And I've gotten into Twitter debates with Nancy about this, and she keeps saying the rose-colored glasses effect is good. And it's like, no, Nancy, what it's showing is that the women that you say are happy, they're not really that happy, unless you think it doesn't matter if women don't care that they orgasm.
Well, if your whole viewpoint is that you have to make God happy, and the way you make God happy is by making your husband happy, and that, you are the lesser of the two, you're the weaker vessel. This is stuff that's taught in churches, and that you have to submit to your husband. And it's all about really his pleasure and not really yours. It's understandable how women can say that, right? Like, yeah, I never orgasm. Oh, I love my marriage though. it's all right? Because you want to please God. You don't want to be under the judgment of God, aka sometimes via the church. When you have people like John MacArthur who are willing to shame a woman who left her husband after he was abusing their kids and later on was found to be SAing their kids and is now in prison for that, right? And John has never actually repented from that thing. It's like, these spaces are designed for that kind of result ultimately.
Yep, exactly.
Love that. I have one more clip. Friends, you've been with us for almost 2.5 hours. Sheila, you've been with me for almost 2.5. The time does fly by, but I love this. This is so good, so helpful. Here's my last clip and this is one that I pulled that I wanted to respond to. I think might tie in some of this stuff, and then we'll end it. So again, friends, thanks for being here. And Sheila, thank you for lending your expertise and wisdom to us. This is so great to have you. Here we go.
Speaking of the red pill stuff.
By the way, red pill, for those who don't know, is like, think Andrew Tate, okay? It's this really high control, misogynistic, I would argue complementarian viewpoint that women are kind of inferior and need to be controlled and owned by men. It's terrible stuff, but it's been taking off in the social media spheres, and there's a direct connection to like this right-wing ethos, and you're only a few steps over to the right and you're in this territory. But I wanted to highlight this clip because I think it's really important.
Speaking of the red pill stuff, conservative women, I don't know if you've seen this, conservative women across the country are experiencing an abnormal amount of men on a first date asking if they are willing to be submissive.
I wonder where that comes from.
Now, this is all stemming from red pill content, which is getting increasingly more and more popular and viral online.
Okay, I wanted to highlight this because this is exactly... I'm making the claim that this is exactly where this complementary patriarchal view leads. You take this stuff to its logical conclusion, you do get red pill. You get men who have no problem asking a woman on the first date, are you willing to be submissive? I mean, again, this is Ephesians 5, right? On the surface anyway, right? This is that kind of talk. So it's interesting to me how Nancy and Alex can have this conversation and kind of advocate for some of these elements, but then Alex can point out that the red pill movement, she decries it. I'm happy to hear her say that, and point out how, yes, we're experiencing a rise in women who are being asked if they're going to be submissive on the first date by men who are finding this red pill content. So, where else do you think this stuff leads?
Yeah, exactly. And it's interesting because both Alex and Nancy actually handled the bit about what it means to submit and what authority means in marriage. It wasn't bad. I mean, I wouldn't have said it the way they did, and I would have, I don't believe in authority in marriage. But their vision of what a proper marriage looks like is not crazy. It looks like the pragmatic egalitarianism, okay? But they're still supporting the words. They're still supporting this theology that puts men over women. And they're saying, oh, but it doesn't lead to anything because look at all these studies, which they're misrepresenting. Oh, but it's all healthy, and people who misuse it, they're just misusing it. But no, people who act it out. The only thing that differentiates complementarianism from egalitarianism is hierarchy. That's the only thing. Okay, because egalitarians believe that men should love their wives as Christ loved the church. Egalitarians believe that, hey, it's okay if a woman stays home and the man goes out and work. You can do whatever works, okay? The only thing that distinguishes it is hierarchy. And when you act out hierarchy, bad things happen. And so the fact that they are promoting a biblical view, which they think is biblical, about hierarchy in marriage, and then they're saying, oh, but isn't it strange that this red pill stuff is happening?
Right.
Yeah, because they're all connected, and you simply can't have a healthy form of acting out hierarchy. Complementarian doctrine is only healthy if you don't act it out. And a doctrine that is only healthy if you don't act it out is not healthy. That's called hypocrisy. Believing in something and not acting it out.
No, I love that. I want to echo that. Listen, I mean, I'm not claiming to be the model egalitarian here, but my wife, she stays home with the kids, and we decided that together, right? Because we wanted to be I work from home most of my day. We wanted to be with our family as much as possible. Now, if my wife's name is Sarah, if she wants to get a job, she's free to do so. I tell her that all the time, but we both agree that it makes more sense. And so you're right. Like it's not that having your partner stay home with the kids or something is bad, or that it's automatically complementarian. It's about the hierarchy that goes with the complementarian theology of, it's God, me, the man, and then my wife, and then the children. That's where things go haywire. And like you said, just to reiterate, if you act that out, we see where the data leads, which means it's not a belief worth holding. Maybe you should find a new belief and live that one out instead.
Yeah, and what I just want to tell, like, Christian pastors who are teaching this stuff, preach what you practice. The majority of you practice egalitarianism, so please start preaching that instead of preaching complementarianism. I stayed home with my kids too. I homeschooled all the way through high school, both my girls. My girls are planning to homeschool. Like, we are egalitarian, and we're doing, so it's like this stuff is not necessarily toxic. It's the hierarchy and the power structures that are toxic.
I love that. Sheila, you have been just amazing. You and Beth both. We covered so much, and I can't thank you enough. Folks, the book is The Great Sex Rescue. Plus, you have another one out, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. Is that behind you? And there's another one too?
There's four. Okay, so
plug away.
Great Sex Rescue and She Deserves Better are our two big ones. And then if you have a couple, let's just get married, Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex helps them get started well without sexual pain, without the orgasm gap, without all of that fun stuff.
And you have a very public platform online on Twitter or X, whatever we're calling it, Threads. You're everywhere. Where can folks find you? What's the handle?
Okay, so just go to baremarriage.com, and all of my links are there, baremarriage.com, and you'll also find our courses and our books and everything. Yeah.
Sheila, thank you for your time. We'll do it again soon. I really appreciate it.
Yes.
Thanks. All right, friends, there you go. I mean, 2.5 hours. This is, for me, this is where all the fun stuff happens. It is great to be with you. Hopefully you found this whole conversation helpful. We had Beth Allison Barr on about maybe almost an hour ago now, talking about women's suffrage and responding to the claims made by Nancy. Then Sheila and I talked about all the other claims. There's so much here, so much to unpack. I'm so grateful for all of you watching this live or listening to this on podcast. If you want to support the work that we do, we are a nonprofit organization holding space for thousands of people as they navigate a better way forward in their faith. If you want to donate, you can click on the link in our show notes. You can do a super chat. All the finances go right to TNE, the organization. And just so you know, we are completely financially transparent. You can literally go to our website. You can see our profit and loss statement. We have it all there. There are absolutely no secrets to where the money goes. Every cent goes to helping people find a better path forward in their faith, hold evangelicalism accountable, and hold space for folks who have been marginalized by the church. Please feel free to share this video, subscribe to our channel. I love doing this work. It's such a privilege. It's such an honor. Thank you for being here. Talk to you all later on.